Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. This is the uh, penultimate meeting of this reading cycle. So almost through with both the books. Also, just to clarify, we realized that in the original schedule, by the original schedule, we had just proposed finishing to read the Nagaratnamal book today, which is why we sent that message out saying, okay, let's split the last two chapters between today and the next section. So essentially, if you've already read chapter 10, that's fine. We'll just reserve it for discussion next week. And so today we want to focus on chapter 9, one chapter of the book. Also, we don't have Santosh and Lakshmi are not able to join us today right on time because of other things. So what I will be doing is I will be kind of presenting a summary of both the chapters, but I'm going to also therefore approach it very differently and go into very less detail so that I don't land up talking for a very long time. Okay, so I just thought I'll keep it very broad, focusing on just the main ideas and the takeaways from the chapters instead of summarizing the details, and we leave the details for a written format. Okay, so let me start with I think the Nagaratnamal book. Okay, so the very sort of broad focus points that I uh, noted down from this is, of course, this chapter sort of goes further into the evolving and the changing sort of status of the Tyagaraja Aradhana, right? Which is essentially what was a majority of the discussion in the immediate previous chapters. But this chapter suggests, as the years go on, how the three factions, for different reasons, invariably find a kind of a unification point and are brought together and are finally unified into a single Tyagaraja Aradhana. Of course, it talks about how the of the main pillars who held on to each of these factions. With both the Periyakachi and the Chinnakachi, there is the case of deteriorating health or the inability to hold the attention of funders or the crowds and so on and so forth. So essentially, even from a very practical standpoint, sustaining these three factions separately, of which perhaps Nagaratnam was the most successful, right? Even at the point of the year before which the three factions were unified, her sort of women's only Aradhana seems to have been the most successful and the smoothly run, because she was still managing to raise the funds that were required for it and very much the support of the local people as well. The Periyakachi seemed to be struggling a lot from both of these, perspectives. So you're also talking about, a time where this has lasted for a good few years. There has been these factions against each other, trying to fight for attention within the same space. So invariably, they are at a point where the suggestion of a unification is welcomed by all three factions. What's very nice to see is also that while each one had, of course, their ideological standpoints, there seems to be a general sense of welcoming the possibility of these differences to be resolved and to invariably form a single unified voice or a unified space through which these musicians could pay their respects to, a composer who was, of course, ultimately dear to all of them. Now, what was interesting for me in terms of the unification was, of course, the formation of a single organization or a committee of sorts, which seems to be very much on the lines of the sabhas, for instance, that exist, in Chennai and continue to exist in Madras, Chennai today. Right? So it's a very formal organization, which the key changes from the previous three factions is that it has the presence of a lot of non-musicians as part of the committee, which is definitely going to affect how the event itself functions. But that's a very major shift. And the other thing that they speak about is the conduct of the Aradhana itself, whether it was about having a very big political or business figure inaugurating the Aradhana in the first few years of the unified thing, how the inclusion of a lot many more musicians finding representation, which can be both a good and a bad thing, right? One is you're saying, okay, you're diversifying it, many musicians are able to come and sing. But the cons of this were, of course, shrinking the amount of time given to each musician, and of course also compromise of quality, right? If it was just brought in as someone's favorite and so on and so forth. So there's both pros and cons to this new unified faction that is created. Good news is that women had pretty much come to stay, right, in all respects within how this Aradhana functioned. There seemed to have been no debate going forward in terms of whether women will or will not perform, who are these women who will perform, so on and so forth. And they also seem to have had a very active role. They name at least 5 women who are part of this committee and had decision-making authorities, as well as events that started happening in Madras to raise funds for the Aradhana. The women musicians played an important part in it. Now, as far as the Nagaswaram artists are concerned, this seems to have been a little bit of to and fro that went on, because one of the initial conditions on which the factions were unified is that the Nagaswaram artists will not perform from the mainstream dais at all, and somehow this was agreed to. But finally, when the first Aradhana took place, there was a little bit of a U-turn on this position, because there was a little bit of a pushback from within the Nagaswaram artist community, and thankfully and rightfully so, they finally find their place, at par with the other musicians who would perform as well. Yeah, and in 1949, it seems like it is the first time which set the kind of a tonality for what we continue to see as the Aradhana even today, which was when the musicians sing together. All the musicians perform together, performing the 5 specific kritis of Tyagaraja, which are called the Pancharatna kriti. So that's something that they start only in the year 1949. All of this, of course, is happening against the background of this Prevention of Dedication Act, of which very little is told to us within this chapter itself. But the only perspective we have is that the Bombay Presidency has already passed this act. The bill is introduced in the Madras Legislative, but not much has moved within this initial time period because of the war breaks out, and so there are other things are vying for the attention. But this definitely forms the background to everything that's going on with respect to the Aradhana in Tiruvayar. And some instances, so there is a balance of instances that is told to us in terms of how Nagaratnamal herself is treated, given the fact that she comes from this community, by certain patrons or donors that she visits to try and raise money for the Aradhana itself. There is one particular anecdote that is given. And also from the perspective of the loss of power of the princely states. So at the end of the chapter, it mentions how she goes back to Mysore, her hometown, to kind of raise money to build a chatram, a chowtry, a Mysore chowtry in Tiruvayar. But the opportunities that there are for performances and for the amount of money that she's able to raise is actually far lower compared to her past years, more owing to the fact that the power of these patrons, or these the influence that they had, has also been steadily sort of declining. So all of this is happening against the background of the Dedication Act. On the personal end, it seems like she starts to become more of a person who is not not concerned with personal wealth or earning money for herself anymore, and practically everything that she earns, she somehow channelizes it back to the Aradhana in one way or the other. Her interests seem a lot more dedicated. She dedicates a lot more of her time to teaching of mainly of Tyagaraja compositions, but also of other compositions. And it seems to be very interesting, thing where she doesn't miss any opportunity to teach a young person or a child in Tiruvayar, for instance. And she's constantly thinking about how can these things be preserved, right? This repertoire sort of be preserved for posterity or handed down to the next generation in a good way. Of course, her failing health is also called into mention over here. And the important thing is, so now she starts to own a home in Tiruvayar, which is an important thing because she's only lived in a rented home in Tiruvayar all through this period. Of course, she's sold off her home in Madras. The proceeds that have come from there have also gone towards the creation of the samadhi and things around of that. But as a result of being an advisor, sorry, on a feature film that was made on Tyagaraja, she's basically able to, not by herself, but the producer of the film buys her a home that she can cover. So she starts to live in her own house, but there again, something that she opens out to anybody who comes to Tiruvayar to visit the cinema. Finally, the chapter ends with mentions of course, her place within the freedom struggle per se, right? And what was her take? There is also a mention to say that there was not very much active involvement that she had with the mainstream freedom struggle that was going on. There is a mention of one article that she writes where her thoughts about the colonial rule sort of are made explicit. But as India gains independence in 1947, it's sort of a bittersweet thing that happens because the two main things of events of implication as far as Nagaratnamal is concerned is the removal of the ban on Radhika Santvanamu that the Madras presidency and those in charge essentially bring into effect immediately. But at the same time, you have in November that year the Prevention of Dedication Act that comes into effect within the Madras presidency region. There was an interesting mention which said that she sort of continues to perform these kind of sevas that only the Devadasis were meant to do at temples, at her own temple, of which she had built to Tyagaraja, which somehow she could not be stopped from doing since she owned the place and she had built it herself. But it says that she continues to do this service for Tyagaraja, which otherwise Devadasis were performing for deities in other temples, very much, even despite the Prevention of Dedication. So this was kind of the main umbrella things for me that stood out as sort of the backdrop of what the chapter was trying to lead us towards. Very probably just a few minutes on the Muthulakshmi Reddy, where I did not even go into making sort of multiple takeaways, and this is something that I'd also appeal to you for some perspective regarding, because I personally found this chapter 5 of the Muthulakshmi Reddy book, a little harder to assimilate from a point of view of, just there seemed to be a lot of disparate information, all of them salient, but I have actually struggled to see how to make sense of it and bring it together in my head. And the main takeaways, of course, is that there's a constant mention of various events, various avenues through which she fought for, particularly for the raising of the marriageable age of women. So basically working against child marriage, raising the age of consent for marriage for both boys and girls, and particularly, of course, women. Looking at and doing significant work in the area of trafficking, illegal trafficking of women in prostitution. And the two, for me, points that stood out in this were mentions which said that she was very clear that the law has to be equal for men and women when it came to the matter of trafficking or the matter of prostitution, in the sense that you punish both the man and the woman involved equally, was what she was always canvassing for. But ultimately, unfortunately, which did not is not what found its way into the law, because there was enough might, it seems like, on the other side, where because the men who were involved were perhaps influential, wealthy or prominent men, somehow the brunt of the law, right, while making this illegal, pretty much the women had to face. So, but I found it very interesting that that was something that she, very noteworthy, that was something that she very, very seriously campaigned for, right? But ultimately had to make compromises when it needed to be passed into law. And the other very interesting thing and forward looking thing that I thought was mentioned is the welfare measures associated with the illegal trafficking. She always seemed to have been thinking through the problem in a 360-degree way, right? What happens when you rehabilitate these men? You need a place for the girls to go. The need to have, women police force, women social workers who can be there assisting the girls, even, as and when they are being either rescued, from these situations and so on and so forth. So that I thought was the ability to look at a problem in a very 360 degrees way, and not just as, clamping the symptom first and let's think of everything else later, seemed a very important thing to me. And of course, all of this somewhere seems to come from the very serious fight for the cause of education, believing that everybody needs to have access to education because that empowers them to make choices, to live a life of freedom, and how access to education cannot exist if there's child marriage, and access to education cannot exist if women are, being trafficked and so forth. So somehow everything else that she stood for seems to always stem from this more central idea of believing that education, access to education, is something that everybody needs to have. So this was really, for me, the most salient sort of takeaways. There is a lot of mention, of course, of the people she's meeting, the particular instances where she's fighting for these bills and so on and so forth. But honestly, like I said, I really struggle to kind of create a story, or or weave a kind of a comprehensive narrative for myself in terms of what I wanted to take away from it. And these were really the main things that stood out. So if there's something that I am, missing from the chapter in terms of, an important narrative, I really love for you to share on that. So, yeah, over to all of you for comments, thoughts, additions.
Yeah, Purva, just on the Muthulakshmi Reddy chapter, especially when you were bringing out all of these points, right? Also because I read two of the chapters back to back, what really stood out to me throughout the course of the book is that her life was a struggle from the beginning. This I'm just trying to like create takeaways from the book as a whole. So in the beginning, she had issues in school where they would, like, she was the only one of her kind in a classroom, and teachers were talking about having a physical partition between her so that she wouldn't distract her classmates, and that's how her life started. Her dad became her first advocate, and then she went to university and her life did not get any easier. And uh, and after that, domestic life made things even harder for her. She had to deal with the loss of uh, her relative, and she had a lot of domestic responsibilities when she adopted her child. And I think through the beginning few chapters, it becomes very clear how uh, or rather why she was developing these views that she had, right, on child marriage, for example, because something so personal had happened to her, on the Devadasis, and why she was against this practice because of the way that of the community her mom came from, and how she saw that disparity between her being her mother's daughter and her being her father's daughter. So I think that all of that, I think, comes to closure in this chapter, where all of that, all of those decades of influences and all of these narratives actually lead to her wanting to very aggressively, in a great way, affect change in society and make sure that nobody else has to face these issues. And uh, she couldn't stand on the shoulders of giants, but she wanted to become one of the giants that further generations of women specifically could whose shoulders they could stand on. So I think that's what became very clear. Between the previous chapter, it became domestic issues. I mean, in the sense that her life was very hard because of domestic workload. And then the fact that she and her husband were both very prominent, influential people, uh, and they had a life to manage at home, right? And then now I think her, at this point in her life, her sphere of influence has really like magnified hugely. And throughout the course of the chapter also, we see that, okay, it starts at a more regional, community level, state level, but then it suddenly magnifies to the level of the country and the future and these big questions that nobody has asked about Indian women, right? So I think that's like this chapter, although like I agree with you in that it was very uh dense and fact heavy. Like I learned a lot more about Indian history in this one chapter than I think I've done in the last few years. But I think this was really the culmination of all of those decades of her influences to me. That's the way I see it.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That it's really what does she do with her life, and what she stands for, right? That's inspired by absolutely.
I agree with Anushka Ka on that, but I wanted to point out regarding the her advocacy for trafficking laws. It's just something that I thought was interesting. I'm not sure why she wanted to advocate for equal sides on both parties, but instead of rather advocating for the law to punish men involved in trafficking, because I'm assuming at the time, of course, men are trafficked as well now, but at that time, I'm assuming women were trafficked a lot more. So I'm wondering why she wanted to advocate for equal law instead of a law to punish men instead of women. So I thought that was interesting when I read that chapter.
I think what I understood by that, in the sense that if there is somebody who, in the case of children, it's different, right? When you are trafficked and you have no choice or way out of it. But if you understand the legal implications of it and you continue to practice it as a profession, right? And so both the man and woman, the man who solicits the woman and the woman who provides the services will both be punished equally. That's how I understood it. I'm sure it wasn't the case with minors who were, kept against their will and things like that. That was my understanding, but I don't know if I was wrong.
Yeah, that makes a little more sense because I was just wondering, I was like, if, the women who were doing this against their will, if they were punished as well, how does that make any sense? Or why would you advocate for an equal law to punish both? But I think this perspective puts it a different way.
And another thing that I thought of in this respect is it becomes very clear that in the Legislative Assembly, she was constantly having to make concessions in what she asked for, and she was not happy about it. So I think that from her point of view, this could have also been her being prudent in terms of how do you appeal such formative reform to to a legislative assembly that is, I don't know, 99.99 whatever percent men, right? So I think in some sense, it was clear that she believed in it a lot, but it was also the more pragmatic thing to do, is what I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think it's for starters to even propose or table bills that were, that were making such things, which I think is so futuristic and so, this ability to. Was there a mention somewhere in the chapter? Now lines are blurring for me in terms of which chapter this was, but it also just seemed like this understanding of um, uh, what women's rights sort of meant, right? So the battle was not against the men. The battle was not, in a way, a sense of like, this against that at all. And I thought that just to have a, not just her, but all the women who are working with her at that point of time, have this clarity of what it is that you are working towards, what is the larger picture, and therefore one can also see that there are, everything is as important in the puzzle, right? One battle won is not enough, and everything needs to fall into place. And they seem to have, uh, you know, championed all these causes with equal fervor, right? To fight for all these things at the same time, and it can't be, okay, one is done, that's good enough, which is another concession that people usually give into, right? Saying that, okay, we've won one of the things, that's fine, right? So we have something to sort of speak of, so to say. But that's something that really spoke to me, the clarity in terms of, and the courage to put forward these propositions to start with. And yeah, it's although it is not spelled out in so many words, I think what you said, Anushka, is so true, right? You're battling ultimately against a majority, uh, you know, male legislative assembly, and decisions will happen in that favor. So, yeah, losing.
Uh, so one of the things that I wanted to discuss was uh, what pulled Muthulakshmi Reddy towards Gandhi's thoughts and uh, his preferences, because I think Muthulakshmi Reddy, in various instances, she is not in favor of women just blindly following traditions and following things in the name of religion. But uh, in one place, I think when she agrees with Gandhi, on page 99 and 100, I think she says she believed it was essential to learn about one's own religion and recommend religion to be taught in schools. But I was just wondering if she has been striving at many instances to, break down the pattern that religion and the association with religion and certain strict religious traditions were. She was trying so hard to break that down, but she also advocates to learning the importance of religion in schools, and that too for everybody. So I was wondering what she meant by that, and what made her, you know, tie up with the thoughts of Gandhi. These were two things that I was thinking about.
Actually, just after the reference, after the quote that you just read, the immediate next paragraph, I think, goes into a little bit of that. And that last line of that paragraph is interesting to me. So it says, every society was articulated at two levels, and its basic values and insights, its central organizing principles had an enduring significance, whereas its beliefs and practices were subject to constant revision. And I think that was that point of thing, right, where you believe that there is a traditional framework which offers you some kind of um, more like enduring values, uh, that guide decisions you make, but the practices or the beliefs that exist in that moment may not necessarily be set in stone and should be subject to constant revision, while holding on to, I think, those the value system. I think that's how I understood it, and that's the sort of balance that both of them seem to strike between why it was important to have tradition there and not kind of dismiss it, right? So you allow tradition to inform you, but you don't allow it to. You don't allow the existing customs to sort of become the flag bearer of the tradition. I think that's how I understand.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I don't know in what context this was brought up, but doesn't she say that when she's arguing towards something being put one of the bills she was proposing, she mentions that um, I think the rebuttal that she got was, this is so new, society is not going to be able to adjust to it. To that she said that anything if done long enough becomes a custom. So I think by that she's doing two things. I really don't remember what actually. But there's two things she's saying. One is that uh, just because it's a custom does not make it uh, golden, in that it's just something that has been repeated for long enough that it's become custom. And second is she challenges these questions on adoption of whatever legal frameworks or bills that she proposes, by saying that if this gets done long enough, it will become a custom. So I think that's what she does.
Absolutely. I think that's a comparison between sati and child marriage, where isn't it what's proposed is that in the case of child marriage, there was a lot of reticence to uh, deal with it, or at its core, because it was a religious subject. Um, but while sati also being religious, you're just talking about women died, right? It was an extreme thing and it was detrimental. So yeah, I remember that part also. Let me see.
Yeah.
I think it's on 112. Where she says, yeah, she insisted that any practice observed for some years would become a custom. And when a law member argued that this was not like sati, which was a more heinous custom, she flew into a rage and argued sharply that child marriage was even worse because it led to that problem.
And another important thing that I found interesting was that she wanted women to take responsibility, uh, even whether they were punished or given equal rights. Everything had to be they had to be responsible of their actions. And she also wanted women to be vocal about their sufferings and their needs. So I think in page 114, he says, "We are responsible for the evils we tolerate, and for those we do not resist actively." So that pretty much tells how she led her life. And yeah, that you need to voice both what you need and what you uh, don't.
Uh, while we're on that, something that I read in chapter 9 of Nagaratnamal comes to my mind immediately, which I found very again, just how these women were able to view their world, right? Although they may not have necessarily, uh, you know, necessarily grown up like that, or did not have a favorable, environment that was leading them to think in that direction. There's even her thoughts about what she thought about, I think, male chauvinism or something like that. I'm just trying to find that. I don't know any one of you. So was that the previous chapter? I think I'm really confused.
I think it was from chapter 8.
Chapter 8, right? Yes, yes. But that really sort of stayed in my mind. Yeah, I'm gonna find it. It's on. It was chapter 8 indeed. Uh, Page 163 and 164, where kind of it goes into the detail of also her, how she sort of stood in support of the Indian man in the domestic sphere, so on and so forth. But at the end of it, it says something. The author's observation I find interesting actually. perhaps her inability to recognize male chauvinism or her ability to deny its very existence was responsible for her success. And I just thought, of course, the first half of that, right? The inability to recognize male chauvinism, I think it also, in many ways, today that would be considered coming from a place of privilege, right? If a woman said, oh, the male domination doesn't exist, invariably, you say, okay, you come from a privileged space to be able to talk like that. But that's definitely not the truth about her life, right? She doesn't come from a place of privilege to be able to, be able to view her world like that, with and possibly what was responsible for the way she led her life. That was a very fascinating observation by the.
Yeah, sorry to come back to the Muthulakshmi chapter again, but I just thought of this. So the thing is, the title of the chapter was quite interesting, actually. It's called Yuga Dharma and Creative Citizenship. Both of those words that I've actually not, phrases that I've not come across before. So I think the the first paragraph under the chapter talks about Yuga Dharma, in that uh, dharma is not this monolithic concept that is like agnostic to what time you live in, and it's moldable, and it's something that is sensitive to social context the way it is as of a given moment in time, right? I think that, and this concept of creative citizenship. So I checked online. It says there's a very nice, I think, summary of it. I'll read it out. It's from this Oxford academic website. It says we identify varieties of creative citizenship among case studies. This is a paper as a step to differentiating characteristics, including questions of motivation, purpose, and context, and drawing a useful distinction between collective and connective acts of citizenship. I think this itself is, when after we've read the Muthulakshmi Reddy chapter, it makes a lot of sense why they named it as this. And they say that acts of creative citizenship make or produce something new, and in parallel induce a critical reflection on political, social, or cultural issues. So I think, like what you were saying in terms of Muthulakshmi taking a 360-degree view of things and not just looking at something as cause and effect and how you solve it. I think this kind of uh, summarizes that well, in that it is truly creative citizenship, what she did do.
Would you be able to read the definition of what you read about creative citizenship once more? I'd just like to.
Yeah, I'll read that sentence. I'll also send it on the Zoom, but this is on my phone. So yeah, they say that acts of creative citizenship make or produce something new, and in parallel induce a critical reflection on political, social, or cultural issues. And before that, they say that it draws a useful distinction between collective and connective acts of citizenship. I think that in the way it's worded, it just brought everything very well together. That's why I wanted to share it. I'll send that link.
I think that's a really interesting take, and it makes sense because in terms of Muthulakshmi Reddy's um, take on social welfare, not only did she think about a solution, in terms of trafficking, but she thought about, okay, where do we put in place rehabilitation? What do we do with these men and women afterwards? So that draws like a connection between what the definition that you said in her life and what she did.
Thanks for that, Anushka. I'm just going to pick that up and put it on the WhatsApp group just so that we'll also have it for later, right?
And also on the topic of uh, how how you can be, in this case, this person who wrote this article, but also in the case of Nagaratnama's interaction with DV Gundappa. My favorite bit of that chapter was when she says, no, I am uh, again, okay, I don't have it open, but she says that I am Roga Tyagam, something Roga Ratnam. I was born this, then I became Rogaratnam. Then DVG says, no, now you're actually Tyagaratnam, because she has actually given up everything in her life. She has no agenda of her own, and she is also Tyagaratnam in the sense that it's another play on words, because Tyaga because sacrifice, but Tyaga also because it's Tiruvayur and it's Tyagaraja. So I thought that was a very enjoyable thing to read.
And also the episode of her, standing on stage when Sulamangalam Vaidyanatha Bhagavatar performed Harikatha, and that was very, yeah, that incident.
Yeah, the additional interesting thing in the DVG anecdote was that it says he was a staunch anti Devadasi sort of activist, right? So that's also where he came from, from a personal and a ideological space. So yeah.
I know this is like very broad, but as I was reading these chapters, I just couldn't help but notice how interesting her journey has been. Because going back to chapter one, when I read that as a young child, she had to learn so many things like languages, instrument, dance, music, and then to see like how far she made it, I thought it was just so nice to go through her journey and read every part of it. So I thought that was very interesting to see everything that she's been through. Despite that, she's made it so big, and she was so like widely recognized.
Yeah, and to take off on that, Bhargavi, I think that the fact that we're reading both these chapters from both these books about these two very different, but in some sense very similar women, I think it juxtaposes quite well, because this is a point in time where Muthulakshmi is affecting so much change in a very rapidly changing society, and there's so everything is vying for attention, like Apurva said. But then Nagaratnamar seems to have been the kind of person who would, like, she was, of course, living in the same society at the same time ish that Muthulakshmi was, but her way of dealing with all of this was for her to, in some sense, put blinkers on and focus what mattered to her, rather than, how Muthulakshmi dealt with it. So I think that as women, these two chapters, reading them together, I think shows us how different they were and how similar they were at the same time.
The one thing that I miss, though, from the Lakshmi Reddy book, because of course the sensibility, that it gives you is of this very reflective, very focused, very serious person. But there's lesser anecdotal references than I would like. because I think there's a repeated reference, in the Nagaratnamal book that sort of gives you a sense of her personality beyond all of this, right? Like I almost imagine Nagaratnamal to be this very sassy, very witty, woman. Also someone who, you know, like I mean, clearly from that exchange with DDG, right? Someone who was also very happy to take a joke on herself in many ways, or be a bit self-deprecating. So, it kind of also gives you a sense of the personality that she was. But I feel like, of course, the impression that I have is of a much more of a stoic, serious person. But I feel like that it comes more because of the style of writing, perhaps in this book, which is very like it sticks to the facts, uh, than perhaps what she was as a person. So it'll be interesting to find some references to just see what was her personality like. What would a conversation with her have been like, right?
Yeah, I agree.
The the one other thing that sort of struck me in the initial part of the Muthulakshmi Reddy chapter, where of course the mentions are there to uh, Gandhi lending his support to the prevention of the Devadasi whatever act and things like that. Where of course there's this mixed reference to allowing traditions to be kind of the building blocks on which you build other things, etc. But while that has been mentioned, it would have been interesting to see specifically in the context of, you know, the Devadasi Prevention of Dedication Act, and what the consequence of that was for, the larger tradition of, in this case, dance and music for sure, right? And also other beliefs that may have been held, right? Like hereditary practices, passing on skills from, one generation to other, and so on and so forth. Because that's been something that I've always been interested to understand. Were there internal debates to, even address these as I'm sure there was a recognition that this was a potential consequence, right, of the prevention of dedication. At what level was it considered a serious enough side effect to address? At least so far, right, from all the readings, there is not much that is said about that side. Was this faction who was clearly, uh, you know, for very valid reasons looking at the prevention of dedication, were they talking about these other problems, saying what happens to the artistic side of this tradition, what happens to uh, familial practices and loss of skill when you take away these kind of family existing practices? Because I know for a fact that even today in India, things like sculpture, for instance, right? Traditional sculpture, traditional temple architecture are very family driven, kind of skills. Once again, not necessarily bloodline family, but they expect you to dedicate nothing short of your entire life to truly be able to, take the entire, take a complete understanding of the skill or the craft or the science of what they do, because they believe it takes that kind of an immersive way of learning. And what how is all of this placed in that context, right? These arguments like there's a basic value system that you need to look at, or you cannot dismiss the traditions as being worthless, but how is it looked at from specifically from the point of view of this is something that I'd be interested to find maybe other references to, or
I when we discuss this, I think the practice of Gurukulam and learning staying and learning from the guru, to a shift of where everybody receives education formally, like in the Western countries. This shift probably would have also been around the same time, because there could have been, you know, being misused, a lot of obstacles faced in the Gurukulam system that probably she wanted to change. And uh, maybe the shift in the way of teaching could also have been in play, with the familial learning to everybody learning the skill.
And sorry, can someone elaborate on this act? I might have missed it in the reading, or I might have skimmed through it. What was the purpose of this act?
Um, I'll take a shot at the basics. So it's basically it was introduced as a prevention of dedication of Devadasis in temples. That was essentially what it was. The spirit of it, of course, the inspiration from this faction who were proponents of this were because of course, that meant that the girl spent of course, the dedication happened of a minor girl, right? There's no sort of consent that is taken for the girl. This also meant that the girl lived a life where she doesn't marry, or she doesn't officially marry, but then she's maintained by different patrons. And this led her to a life of I can't remember what was the vocabulary that is used, but the understanding was that it led you to sort of a life of immorality, or uh, basically living a life that was against your will. And the other things that came out of it was, of course, child pregnancies, death at childbirth, etc. So, from my understanding in all the previous chapters of Muthulakshmi Reddy, these are the kind of things that sort of inspire her to fight for the Prevention of Dedication Act. But what the act itself did was simply made it illegal for girls to be dedicated in the temples as Devadasis. But the implication of that meant if it became illegal for them to be dedicated to the temple, it means essentially their livelihood was being taken away from them. This means the temple can no longer maintain Devadasis on their payroll, no longer can provide them with salaries or property, for instance, because of their services to the temple, because the service to the temple was now considered an illegal. And yeah, that's sort of how I would summarize it. But if there's anything else that Anushka might be able to add to this.
Thank you, Oka.
Thank you so much. There's a article that has been shared on the chat. I'm just going to pick that up as well and put it on our WhatsApp group, just so that we have it for later and we can go through it. Thank you.
Also, just another question when we talk about this act, right? In terms of, so what does it mean for a child to be dedicated to the temple, and hence by virtue of the act coming into force, how does this change? Again, I forget the, so there's a word for the what I forget what that ceremony is called, and what that involves. Like there are a couple of different ritualistic practices which are carried out, and I think the direct implications of the act, like you said, would be that they're not on the payroll, and these ritualistic, in terms of how is the deity worshipped, that also changes because now that's not done. But yeah, I'm not able to remember what the specific rituals were that the dancer did. So, like, if anyone remembers that, or I'll also go and look back at it once.
Do you mean in that initiation ceremony or services that were provided later?
I mean, in general, including both of them.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, what Matthew is sharing in the chat is true. So basically, in my understanding, there were different streams of services that they provided. So at one level, it could be absolutely menial things like the cleaning of the temple premises, keeping it clean, tying of the garlands, the flower garlands, etc. So that was the one side. From on the ritualistic side, it involved this Kumbharati thing, which was essentially an important arati that was taken inside the sanctum sanctorum, which was only the Devadasi was allowed to do. I don't think this has been mentioned in either of these books, but there are other articles like in the, for instance, Unfinished Gestures or Bharatanatyam, the Reader, right, Reshmi, other references, which, or even Nitya Sumangali, I think, which is another book which kind of gives you, where the Devadasi would sing and dance in the Sanctum Sanctorum as a one form of worship, right? Despite all the others that have been carried on, and this was carried on in complete privacy. There was only the Devadasi and the deity in the room, apparently. Definitely, the dancers would lead the processional of the deity. So they kind of what I've heard in talks in the past. So I don't have a reference for this, but there were actually different Devadasis who performed these different services in the temple. So they were assigned, I think, based also on their skill level or things like that, where there were different elements of the ritualistic service that they would take.
Yeah, thanks, Apurva.
So maybe we can just circle around and go for any final thoughts, given that we're at 1 hour mark. So any closing thoughts or maybe some points that we haven't addressed so far in today's discussion, impressions.
Yeah, one thing I thought of just when we were discussing this the Devadasi Act and Nagaratnamal's identity as a Devadasi. So the thing is, at least the book doesn't tell us as much about, like, she found her own ways to deal with it. She went up at the Tyagaraja Aradhana, and she did what she would have done at a temple as a Devadasi, which I think is quite remarkable. But even otherwise, she doesn't challenge or attempt to challenge or even show any outwardly uh, expression of contempt, or we don't see that she's necessarily feeling bad or she's feeling remorse over this, right? But I think that what she kind of bolts onto, that goes above, that kind of trumps her identity as a Devadasi, is her identity as, someone who wants to take Tyagaraja's legacy forward. Because at that point she had a choice, right? She could either, it's not as binary as I'm making it out to be, but she had the choice to either go on that path and try to reclaim that Devadasi legacy, or she took this other option of trying to make the most of Tyagaraja and contributing in the way that she could best, given her health, deteriorating health and everything else. So I thought that was quite interesting, that her identity as a Devadasi woman and the last of her kind by like from all considerations would be lower than or not lower than the fact that her devotion to Tyagaraja or her social commitment to taking these things forward would trump that identity that she's actually lived with her whole life, because she is quite old at this point. So that's just something I thought of.
Yeah, I definitely agree there, Anushka, because that was also something that struck me in a sense that, while these women existed and did this work at pretty much the same timeline, somehow to me it feels that they almost seem to be inhabiting very different worlds, right, with very different concerns. And, it almost feels like we're talking about two different timelines or two different places altogether. I Once again, I wonder whether, because the thrust of this particular biography on Nagaratnamal has been on her work, with respect to Tyagaraja, I wonder if that is the case, because I definitely remember, and I'll try to pull out that reference. So, in the chapter in Bharatanatyam Reader, where they present the what was it called? The affidavit, or whatever the Devadasis presented. One of the affidavits in written form that the Devadasis presented to counter this bill, right? Prevention bill in legislature. There are discussions of the roles that these women played in rallying the Devadasis together, in forming what was called a Devadasi association, and Veenadhanam, Bangalore Nagaratnamal, these were all very important players in that. So the fact that it doesn't take sort of main, a very important, was that because it was one part of her life, not necessarily at the core of her own life, or is it because the thrust of this biography is more, with respect to that, I don't know, but I'll try to pull out that reference. And yes, it doesn't definitely give us a emotional sense of what was she feeling, right? In the face of all of these things. But these women were very actively involved in trying to fight this act, for sure. Because I'll try to pull that out and share.
I think just like in I think the author's quote that you described of her inability to recognize male chauvinism. I think similarly she has in the same book, in the previous chapters we read about the arguments she has with Muthulakshmi Reddy's passing of the bill, and how she rallies with Duraikkannammal and Veena Dhanam's residence, and how she advocates for this. But it was, I think, uh, just as how in Muthulakshmi Reddy, they say the choice was made for her when the three women from the Devadasi community approached her house at a point where she didn't know what to do next after her being a legislator and stuff. I think Nagaratnam was also, the choice was taken for her, being a spiritual person that she was, and her reverence for her guru. Uh, this issue sort of helps her navigate towards restoring the samadhi more, even though she was advocating for the Devadasi Act. I think the choice was already slightly taken for her, because she felt she could. Uh, she did advocate in both cases, but I think the choice was already taken for her because she thought it was the God's will, and those visions that she had about uh, saving Tyagaraja's Samadhi, and having people understand the importance of it. Her spirituality kind of helped her steer to take this choice, is what I would think, uh, at the later part of her life.
Yeah. And just to sort of add on to that, it just makes me wonder. Once again, this is just like a very speculative kind of a proposition. Um, Somebody who didn't maybe, instead of choosing the route of actively fighting, right, this decline, it's also the other ways in which you claim, how do you say, legitimacy for your community, perhaps? Because I felt like her whole work in the republication of Radhika Santwana seemed to be an act of defiance, right? Of going out there and saying, it's almost like saying, show me another woman who has written literature like this, right? Without saying it in so many words. And similarly, once one gets into the details of the Aradhana, there is no need for her to fight specifically for, women to find their place in this Aradhana at a time where all the names that are featuring there are essentially Devadasi women. We're not yet talking about, the whatever women from other communities also being musicians, and it just makes me wonder. I don't know if that was her intention, right? Or might be like you're saying, it's just a spiritual calling, that compelled her to go in that direction. One doesn't know. But without Nagaratnakar's work on the Aradhana, at the time that we lost the dancing practice in the temples, we may have also completely lost female existence in the musical line, right? And I'm sure that work was very seminal in ensuring that female musicians found equivalent place in this changing world of music as well, because we could have very well have otherwise taken, another 100 years to rebuild and build, women's place, perhaps. So yes, what was her intention is something that we can only speculate on. But it seems to me that the things that she did was like essentially is saying, okay, this is what the Devadasi community is about, without saying it in direct words. It's almost like by action. I don't know. That's sort of how I think. Bali, any final thoughts you want to share?
I don't think I have any final thoughts for now. I think everything I was kind of thinking of has been so beautifully articulated by the three of you. So, yeah, I think I'll save it for next meeting.
Thanks, Kathy. So I think that maybe that's a good point for us to bring this meeting to a close, and looking forward to next, which is the last one that we spend at least with these books. But looking forward to the next one. See you all.
Thank you. See you.
Sorry, Apurva, just one question. So for the next, I think there are 2 chapters left in the Muthulakshmi book, but we're going to focus on the next one. Like that one's according to schedule, and the chapter 10 for Nagaratnamar.
No, I think what we'll do is we'll try and, because the balance shifts, we'll send out a message so we can basically do all the remaining chapters in both the books. Because essentially one in, just chapter 10 of Nagaratnamar, and I didn't actually notice. So there are 2 more chapters left
in Muthulakshmi. Yeah, I think one is something love and something, and one is cancer care.
Yeah, so maybe we'll just send out a message by, there are 3 more. Okay.
Oh, there are 3? Oh.
Okay. Now, in which case, maybe we'll need 2 more sessions. I don't think we should crowd everything into one. So, but why don't you just give us, a day on this, and we'll just text on the group with a kind of a schedule, right? And all of you are okay if we extend another session and we do like 2 more instead of 1 more? Is that okay?
More than okay. I think for a lot of us, we want that to happen.
Okay, perfect. We'll do that. We'll text the new schedule of that.
Akka, sorry, I don't think I'm receiving messages. Do you mind adding me to this group?
We will do that. Yes,
okay.
I'll do.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. See you next week.